Hello, today we're going to talk to you about extraneous variables. So extraneous variables are any factors that might impact on your outcome measure for your research that isn't associated with the independent variable, so the thing that you're trying to test. So for instance, on Myriad, we're trying to look at the effect of mindfulness on the well-being and resilience of young people. So we need to make sure that we're looking at or controlling for any other factors that might influence the well-being or resilience of our young people. So my name is Louise Auckland and I'm a researcher for the Myriad programme. I actually have two roles in that programme. First of all, I look at social and emotional learning of all the young people on our research. And therefore I'm looking at curriculum and lessons that might be taught about emotional regulation or behavioural regulation for all of the schools that are involved in the research. My second role is to manage the public engagement programme. And the public engagement programme is working with all the young people involved in our research to find out their views on mental health and well-being, perhaps enabling them to do a research programme associated with that, and to look at teenage brain workshops and young people's views on mindfulness.
My name is Isabel Pryor-Neach and I am one of the research assistants on the Myriad project. I have lots of different roles, but some of the main things I do is I go into schools and I help with the data collection with the students. I spend a lot of time liaising with different teachers all over the country, and I also work with Louise on the public engagement programme.
So Isabel, to start us off, are you able to give us an example of an extraneous variable for a research project?
A good example would be, let's say I wanted to find out what the effect of listening to music was on students' ability to revise for and to pass an exam with high grades. I might have two groups of students. One group of students, I ask them to make sure they listen to lots of music throughout their revision process, and I ask the other group of students to make sure they don't listen to any music at all. Then what I would look to see is which group of students were more successful when they passed the exam, so which group of students had higher grades, for example. But there might be some problems with that experiment.
Okay, so for instance, if this group here happened to be A-level students and this group were Year 7 students, that's going to obviously impact on their results. Or if this group here had recently done a revision session with their teacher and recently learned the unit, whereas this group here hadn't been taught the topic particularly well or hadn't been taught for quite a long time and done no revision before their exam, so then both these groups are likely to have different measures.
Exactly, so that would be an example what we would call a participant extraneous variable. So we wouldn't actually know in that example whether the students who'd passed the exam with maybe higher results had done so because they'd listened to music or not. So we'd need to try and avoid in that example differences in the groups of students in the first place. And on Myriad project we try to avoid that kind of participant extraneous variable.
Okay. Now, both you and I have been teachers, so we know that when students go in to do a test, sometimes they're in a classroom that's got keywords and posters all over the classroom, and therefore it's likely to help them get a higher score in their test, whereas other times we put them into a sports hall, like for external exams, where there's no prompts around them that might affect or improve their score, or in this case, an outcome measure. What do we call that?
So that would be called a situational extraneous variable, and within the Myriad project we also try to avoid that as much as possible. So some of the things that we might do to avoid a situational extraneous variable, one of the things we do when we go into a classroom and before we ask the students to sit down and to complete our questionnaires is we make sure that we say almost exactly the same thing, and the instructions are almost exactly the same to each group of students that we visit. We also ask all of the students that fill out our questionnaires to work in exam conditions. For example, if we went into different groups of students in different schools all over the country and we allowed some to work in silence and some to work just in whatever conditions they wanted so they could talk to each other throughout the session, then that could potentially affect the results or the outcome of the questionnaires. How that might happen is, for example, students who are able to talk and to chat throughout the period of time where they're filling out the questionnaires, they might experience some peer influence, so they might be influenced by the other students in the room, the mood of the room, or the noise in the room, or they might have the opportunity to look over other students' shoulders and look at other people's questions and answers to the questions. So that can add a sort of an effect that might influence what the answers they give are in the end. Whereas if we ask students all to work in exactly the same conditions, so in exam conditions, then we can sort of control for that. So we know the students have the opportunity just to look at their computers and they won't necessarily have influence from other students in the room.
Now might be a good time to talk about the research protocol. So the research protocol is a large document that outlines exactly what needs to be done by researchers when they're collecting their data, when they're visiting schools, when they are liaising with schools, and so on. It's a bit like a method that you might use when you're doing an investigation at school, but it includes a lot more detail. This is particularly important because we have a large number of researchers that are involved in our programme, and therefore each of them needs to make sure that they're doing exactly the same when they're collecting their data. A research protocol is also useful for other researchers to find out exactly how we carried out our investigation. So when we publish our results, they'll be able to look through the research protocol and find out what we did when we collected those results. And that includes how we controlled for extraneous variables. So if we go back to Isabel, we'll find out a little bit more about the impact that the researcher might have. So, Isabel, if we're thinking about an investigator going into a school, what impact might they have and what do we call that?
Well, there's something that we call a demand characteristic, and this is something that we might expect to find if a researcher goes into a classroom and either consciously or unconsciously affects the answers that the students might give.
Okay, so for instance, in Myriad, that might be that the researcher comes into the room, greets the young people and then says, well, we're particularly interested in the mental health and well-being of young people, but we're quite concerned about that at the moment. And therefore the young person might fill the questionnaire thinking, oh, the researchers think they're going to find this out, therefore I will put this for my score. So it's sort of influenced how they've answered the questions, whether that's conscious or unconscious, and therefore influenced our results. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So that's a really good example of a demand characteristic that we would try to avoid in the Myriad project.
Okay, by following our protocol.
Exactly.
Okay. Is that the same then as a researcher or an investigator sort of asking a leading question or trying to encourage young people to answer the question in a particular way because that's what they're almost trying to cheat to get the results that they want?
It's similar, but we would actually call that a researcher effect, and that's when a researcher more directly tries to influence what kind of answers the students are going to give.
Okay. And how do we ensure that doesn't happen in Myriad?
So again, that's where we would refer to our protocol and make sure that we say almost exactly the same thing to the students before they sit down to fill out our questionnaires.
Okay, thank you. And I guess a good example of that for us, given that we're looking at the effect of mindfulness in schools and its effect on well-being for young people, might be a researcher going into the classroom and saying, oh, well, you're a mindfulness school, you've had classes, therefore you're all particularly good at managing your emotions, and therefore your well-being must be quite good, and therefore you're likely to score quite highly on this test. And therefore a young person filling in the questionnaire is likely to answer the question slightly higher than they might have done otherwise.
Exactly, that's a perfect example of a researcher effect that we would try to avoid.
Thank you. So, today we've learned quite a bit about extraneous variables and how important it is to make sure that you're considering these whenever you plan your own investigation. They can have an impact on your outcome measure and therefore reduce the validity of your results if you don't consider them properly. So make sure at the planning stage you're thinking about anything else that might affect whatever it is that you're trying to measure, so that you can ensure that you're really investigating your intervention or your treatment or whatever it might be that your investigation is about.